Welcome to Flame Television. My name's David Ledesma, and it's my great pleasure to interview Julian Lee, who's Senior Energy Analyst at the Centre for Global Energy Studies. Julian, welcome. Nice to have you back in Amsterdam.
Yeah, nice to be back.
And thanks for a great presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Good, I'm glad.
Just a couple of things came up from it I'd like to pick up if I can. First of all, in your presentation, you noted that the oil price increase in 15% in quarter one, was not necessarily solely due to the Iranian rhetoric. And I wondered, what type of fundamentals of oil supply have actually been driving that increase?
I think the big thing that's been driving it is the loss of supply.
Right.
The Iranian story has been very much one of sort of a potential future loss of supply when these sanctions come into operation. But we've actually experienced physical loss of supply during the first quarter of this year. The biggest single loss came from South Sudan.
Right.
Following the separation of Sudan into Sudan and South Sudan.
Yeah.
The Sudanese government started charging South Sudan a sum in excess of $30 a barrel to use the export pipelines, which, perhaps not surprisingly, the government of South Sudan thought was a little excessive. And it then escalated to the point where the Sudanese were effectively expropriating oil at Port Sudan, and the South Sudanese government took the decision that the only thing they could do was stop producing, which they did.
How much has that taken out?
So that's 350,000 barrels a day, virtually at a stroke, in sort of mid to late January. And
that's been replaced by what? Because we're down by about 225 kbd.
We're down by about 225.
So where's the upside come from?
The upside really has come from North America, principally.
And that's the shale play,
This is the US shale play.
Right. Okay.
And what we've seen in the US is that with the collapse in US natural gas prices, which are now around $2 a million BTU, everybody who's operating in the US shale is looking for liquids-rich shale, where they can earn their return on the liquids, and the gas is basically a cost-free byproduct.
Which is not good, of course, for the gas price and the gas industry, is it?
It's not, and I mean what we're seeing is that producers who have essentially dry gas acreage in the shale are really suffering.
And are we going to see this in other shale plays that have been talked about?
Well, I think very much the focus at the moment is on the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, which are being developed, and people are looking for the liquid sweet spots in other shale plays.
And what other countries as well, in Europe and China?
I think those are much further down the line. I mean, yes, the interest is there. Europe is at the very early stages of exploration, and I think part of the problem is that some European governments have got very caught up in this sort of shale story and looked at the US and said, shale gas production has gone from zero to where it is now in the space of 4 years, and from nothing, and we can do the same. And what they neglect is the sort of 20 years of primary research and exploration that came before that, we're in all likelihood going to have to go through in Europe too.
And just going back to the US, because there's an interesting point you also raised in your presentation, that's about, of course, US oil independence, which would be quite fascinating almost in geopolitical terms. And I wonder, was anything you'd like to, you could build on that?
I think it is fascinating. I think that perhaps US independence is a little optimistic. North American independence, perhaps, I think is much more achievable, potentially achievable. So if we were to group the US, Canada, and perhaps Mexico together, then we're looking at something much closer to independence, I think. And I think that raises all sorts of hugely interesting questions. I mean, the first is that this is going to back out shipborne, or a large part of shipborne imports of crude oil into the US. West African oil is going to be looking for other markets. It's already being hit. Middle Eastern oil has been in decline in terms of exports to the US for many, many years. But it sort of raises the interesting question that when you get down the line, if the US is not actually taking any crude oil from the Middle East, what does this do to US political and military involvement in the Middle East, US support for Arab monarchies and things like that? Of course, they're still going to have an interest, because unless there is a complete breaking away of North America from the international oil market, and that means a breaking away of pricing and everything else. If that doesn't happen, then whatever happens in the Middle East is still going to be crucial for oil prices. So that's going to...
They're still going to be major producers globally.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But the US isn't going to have the same sort of security of physical supply drivers that perhaps have underpinned its involvement in the Middle East, both politically and militarily up until now.
Well, while talking about the Middle East, if we could just spend a couple of minutes talking about Iran, it's quite interesting. And of course, one of the things you talked about also was the kind of the falling stocks of oil that we're seeing in Europe at the moment. And I was just wondering, should Europe be worried about Iranian supply being shut off, particularly because the countries in southern Europe, Italy, Turkey and Spain, are so reliant on Iranian crude oil. So should the countries be concerned?
I don't think they should. I mean, I think there is plenty of oil around. The International Energy Agency has made it very clear that in the event of a physical disruption to supply, strategic stocks will be available. The UK and the US and others have already been talking about releases of oil from strategic stocks. Now,
is that for pricing reasons or is it for supply reasons?
I mean, that's always difficult to disentangle, and the IEA is very firm that any release will be for supply reasons and not for price reasons. Yes. There is some question that, if you release oil from strategic stocks, where does it actually go to?
Good point.
We saw this with the release last year during the Libyan crisis, that the only physical crude oil that was released was in the United States, and because there's a ban on exporting US crude, it stayed there.
Yep.
So that doesn't perhaps help southern European refiners, but we're seeing the Saudis producing more. We've seen Greek buyers buying more from Libya and from Saudi Arabia. It's much easier to replace Iranian crude in quality terms than it was Libyan crude. I mean, Libyan crude is very light and sweet, and the spare capacity in Saudi Arabia isn't. And it's easier to replace the Iranian crude in quality terms. It may end up being more expensive because the Iranians were prepared to offer a discount. Turkey also, a sizable buyer of Iranian crude. It will continue to buy Iranian crude. It's agreed to reduce its purchases in order to avoid US sanctions, but it won't face the same sort of pressures to embargo Iranian imports as EU members will, and it's made it quite clear that it will continue to import Iranian crude, although at lower volumes. So I think there is crude available, and who knows? We're back around the negotiating table in Istanbul at the moment. Anything could happen.
So just to finish up, where should the oil price be?
I think where will the oil price be rather than where should it be? I mean, I think everyone's view on where it should be depends on where they're sitting around the table.
I run a car. I know where I want it to be.
Well, I do too, and I know where I'd like it to be. But where will it be? I mean, I think where it will be is going to be driven very much by the revenue needs of the oil producers as much as anything else, at least for the time being.
Supply-driven.
I think so. I mean, the Saudis have come out, and the Saudi king has come out and basically said that $100 a barrel is a good price for oil this year. So I don't expect that we'll see it fall much below $100 a barrel. I mean, if we get a build-up of negative pressure and prices start to slide, then I think the Saudis will begin to cut production and try to stop it falling much below 100. But I do think that if we don't get a dramatic reduction in Iranian supply that isn't offset, that by the end of the year the pressure on prices will be more downward than upward.
Well, Julian, thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you also for coming to Flame, because it's useful for us gas people to get an insight from the black stuff.
Well, yes,
thank you very much again.
Really increasingly they're linked.
Of course they are. Thank you.